It was 7:12 in the morning on a cold Thursday in February when Walter Kane, age 74, sat down on a wooden bench outside the Millbrook Public Library with a torn plastic bag at his feet and a coffee cup he had found near the gas station dumpster. His wife, Ruth, age 71, sat beside him. She wore a gray coat that was 2 sizes too big, a knit hat pulled low over her ears, and shoes with a small split along the left sole that let the cold air in when she walked. They had not eaten since the previous afternoon. They had $9 left. 3 weeks earlier, Walter and Ruth Kane had been living in the house they had owned for 38 years. A 4-bedroom colonial on Sycamore Lane in the suburb of Millbrook, Ohio. A house Walter had repainted every 7 years without being asked. A house where Ruth had planted marigolds along the front path every spring since 1987. A house with a porch swing that creaked in a specific rhythm that both of them had long stopped hearing because it had simply become the sound of home. Now they were sitting on a bench outside the library, looking like two people the world had forgotten, which, in a way, was exactly what had happened. Their 3 children had done it cleanly, legally, and with a great deal of paperwork. Michael, 49, was a tax attorney in Columbus. Diane, 46, was a hospital administrator in Cincinnati. And Patrick, 43, was a software executive in Seattle who had not been home for Thanksgiving in 6 years. They had divided Walter and Ruth's life the way you divide a restaurant bill. Efficiently, without sentiment, and with each person making sure they paid no more than their share. Actually, they paid nothing. They took everything. But the children had missed one thing. They always do. In the basement of the house in Sycamore Lane, behind the water heater, inside a fireproof steel box that Walter had bought at a hardware sale in 1994 and that nobody had ever asked about, was a document that none of the children knew existed. Walter knew, Ruth knew, and one other person knew. A man who had lived 3 houses down for 22 years, a retired mail carrier named George Ellis, who had hand-delivered the document to Walter on a rainy afternoon in 2001 and had never spoken of it again. In this story, you will see how 2 elderly people lost everything to the children they raised. You will see what happens when a stranger does what a family refused to do. And you will see what was hiding in that fireproof box and how it changed everything. If you believe that loyalty should outlast usefulness, subscribe before we begin. We share stories like this every week, and this one is going to stay with you. Walter Kane had been a high school history teacher for 41 years. He was the kind of teacher that students remembered decades later, kind who stayed after school to help a failing sophomore understand the causes of World War I, not because it was his job, but because he genuinely believed that a person who understood history was less likely to repeat it. He had thick hands and a quiet voice and a habit of pausing mid-sentence when he was thinking, just long enough that students learned to wait for the second half, because it was always worth it. Ruth had been a licensed practical nurse for 33 years, working the night shift at Millbrook General, 3 days a week for most of their marriage. She had the particular tiredness that comes not from laziness, but from decades of doing hard things for people who could not do them for themselves. She had calloused feet and soft hands, which Walter always thought was the right way around for a nurse. She made soup from scratch every Sunday. She kept a small notebook in her apron pocket where she wrote down things she wanted to remember. A patient's birthday, a neighbor's surgery date, which grandchild had lost their first tooth. They had been married for 47 years. They had met at a church picnic in the summer of 1977. Walter had knocked a cup of lemonade off a folding table and it had landed on Ruth's shoes. He had apologized 4 times. She had laughed all 4 times. They were engaged by Christmas. They had raised 3 children in that house on Sycamore Lane, and they had done it with a consistent and quiet generosity that they never once talked about, because it never once occurred to them to call it sacrifice. They simply did what parents do when they love their children more than they love their own comfort. They refinanced the house when Michael started law school so he would not graduate with debt. They drove Ruth's car until the transmission failed and did not replace it for 2 years so Diane could have helped with the down payment on her first apartment. They canceled the vacation they had planned for their 40th anniversary, a week in Nova Scotia that Ruth had clipped photos of from a travel magazine and kept on the refrigerator for 3 years because Patrick's startup had a cash problem and Walter wrote him a check for $18,000 without being asked twice. They skipped their own dentist appointments to cover the children's. They ate the same 7 meals on a rotating schedule for 15 years because variety was a luxury they classified as unnecessary. They wore the same winter coats until the linings gave out. Walter's last new coat before everything fell apart was purchased in 2009. Michael moved to Columbus in 1998 and called every Sunday for about 6 years, then every other Sunday, then once a month. Then on birthdays, if he remembered. He remembered Walter's more reliably than Ruth's, which Ruth noticed but never mentioned. The last time Michael visited the house on Sycamore Lane in person was 4 years before the Thursday morning on the library bench. He had stayed for 3 hours and spent 40 minutes on his phone. Diane called more often but said less. She had a particular skill for conversation that covered distance without bridging it. She could talk for 20 minutes about her hospital's new parking structure and end the call, leaving Ruth with the feeling that nothing real had been exchanged. She forgot their anniversary the last 4 years running. She sent a card on Walter's 73rd birthday that was clearly from a gas station, the kind with a cartoon balloon on the front. Patrick sent money occasionally, which Walter and Ruth quietly put into a savings account because accepting it felt like admitting they needed it, and they were not yet willing to do that. Patrick had not met his own nephew, Diane's youngest boy, in person. They had been FaceTimed. Patrick considered this sufficient. The warning came 3 years before the bench. Ruth had a small stroke, not devastating, but real. She spent 4 days in the hospital where she had worked for 3 decades, which was a particular kind of strange. None of the children came. Michael sent flowers. Diane called the attending physician directly to ask about long-term care costs. Patrick texted a heart emoji. Walter sat beside Ruth's hospital bed for all 4 days. He slept in the chair. He brought her the specific brand of ginger tea she liked from the machine on the second floor. He held her hand while she slept. When she came home, he painted the bathroom railing a brighter color so she could find it in the dark. He did these things without being asked, without announcing them, without any visible calculation of what they cost him. Ruth got better, but the stroke had given the children an idea. The family meeting happened on a Saturday in January, 8 days after Walter's 74th birthday, which had passed without a single child in the house. Michael organized it. He called it a planning session, which was accurate in the way that a demolition is accurately called construction work. It does involve the building, just not in the direction you assumed. They gathered at Michael's suggestion at a restaurant downtown, rather than at the house on Sycamore Lane. Walter thought this was odd. Ruth brought her notebook because she always brought her notebook. The restaurant had white tablecloths and a wine list, and Michael ordered a bottle without asking what anyone else wanted. Diane had printed materials. That was the first sign. People do not bring printed materials to conversations unless the conclusions have already been reached. Michael did the talking. He was good at talking. 49 years old and 22 years of practicing law had given him a voice that sounded like reason even when it was not. He said the word practical 11 times in 40 minutes. He said for your own good 4 times. He said the house is really too much to manage at your age twice, despite the fact that Walter had just recaulked the kitchen sink himself and Ruth had cleaned the gutters in October. The house, Michael explained, had been quietly put into a family LLC 3 years earlier, during a document signing session that Walter vaguely remembered as being about estate planning and tax efficiency. Michael had prepared those documents. Walter had trusted him. He was his son and a tax attorney, which felt like a combination that could only go one direction. The LLC, Michael now explained, was co-managed by all 3 siblings, and the 3 siblings had agreed. He used the word agreed as though agreement among themselves was the same as agreement with their parents, that the house should be sold. The proceeds would go into a managed trust, also overseen by the siblings. Walter and Ruth would receive a monthly allowance from the trust. There was a number on one of Diane's printed pages. It was not a generous number. The savings account, the one with Patrick's occasional transfers and 30 years of careful deposits, had already been moved. Michael called this consolidation. The car was Diane's now. She needed a second vehicle for her eldest son who had just gotten his license. She would be picking it up on Tuesday. What was left? A storage unit in Millbrook that Walter had rented for $60 a month since 1998, where he kept his old teaching materials, a broken recliner he had always planned to repair, 3 boxes of Ruth's nursing textbooks, and a fireproof steel box that none of the children had ever seen the inside of. The storage unit payments were now behind by 2 months. Michael said they would cover it temporarily. His tone made clear that temporarily was doing a lot of work in that sentence. They had also, as a practical measure, arranged for Walter and Ruth to move into a place called Sunrise Gardens. Michael showed them a brochure. It had a photograph of an elderly woman smiling at a plant. Ruth looked at the brochure for a long time. Then she set it down on the white tablecloth next to her untouched wine. "We're not going to Sunrise Gardens," she said. Michael's face did a complicated thing. "Mom, it's not a discussion. The house is already under contract." She stood very still. Walter did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice in 47 years of marriage, and he did not raise it now. He looked at his 3 children. Michael in his blazer, Diane with her printed pages, Patrick on a video call propped against the salt shaker because he could not be bothered to fly from Seattle. And he said, "What about the storage unit?" Michael shrugged. "Keep it if you want. There's nothing valuable in there." Walter nodded. "Then we'll keep it." That was the only thing he said that mattered, and none of the children understood why until much later. They moved Walter and Ruth out of the house on Sycamore Lane on a Tuesday. A moving company came. Not for Walter and Ruth's things, for the furniture the children wanted to distribute among themselves. Michael took the dining table. Diane took the living room set. Patrick, via instructions sent by email, claimed the vintage record player Walter had saved up for in 1983. Walter was allowed to pack 2 suitcases. Ruth packed 1.5, then gave Walter room in hers for his teaching journals because she knew he would not think to fight for them. Michael drove them to a budget motel on the edge of town, the Millbrook Motor Inn. It had a neon sign with a burned-out letter, so it read Mill Oak Motor Inn. He gave them $400 in cash and said he would set up the monthly trust allowance by the end of the week. He drove away at 4:17 in the afternoon. Ruth stood in the parking lot and watched the car until it was gone. Then she took out her notebook and wrote down the time. The trust allowance never came. Michael's assistant, a young woman named Cassie who had no idea what she was caught in the middle of, sent an email saying there were processing delays, then another email saying the account setup required additional documentation, then silence. By the end of the first week, Walter and Ruth had $284, by the end of the second, $191, by the third, $9. The motel cost $58 a night. They had stopped paying it by day 4, and the manager, a soft-spoken man named Raj, who was himself a father of 3, had quietly not said anything for longer than he should have. On the 16th day, he knocked on their door at 8 in the morning and said, very gently, that he was sorry but he needed the room. Ruth thanked him. She meant it. He had given them 16 extra days he did not have to give. They had nowhere to go, so they went to the library bench. The temperature that Thursday morning was 28 degrees. Walter had his winter coat, the one from 2009, still functional. Ruth had the oversized gray one that had been a donation from a patient years ago that she had never gotten around to giving away. She was glad now that she hadn't. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air. Ruth's left shoe let in the cold at the split in the sole. Walter had the torn plastic bag at his feet. Inside it were 2 of his teaching journals, Ruth's notebook, a change of clothes each, and the key to the storage unit on Palmer Street. They sat. People walked past. A woman in a puffy jacket glanced at them and looked away quickly, the way people do when they see something they have decided not to see. A young man in a suit walked by talking into his earpiece and did not look at them at all. A mother with a stroller crossed to the other side of the path. Walter looked at Ruth. "You warm enough?"